So what is a cell? You've probably heard the word before. You may have some idea of what it is, but what I want to think about with you is what a cell does, and then we'll look at how it can do it. Okay, so big picture, and then let's focus in on the mechanics and the machinery that make it happen. So cells are regulating environments. They're using energy. We talk about cells using energy in you, known as ATP. We'll look at this more. Every single cell in your body responds to the environment. Now, this does not necessarily mean the external environment, so the outside world. It may be responding to your internal environment, changes in temperature, pH, how much water you have, how much salt you have, all of these things it has to deal with. It's going to have to maintain very complex organization. So you'll see when we look inside cells, the complex machinery that is involved with these cells is astonishing. And it has to reproduce. So a cell is going to have to divide and make another cell just like itself. So we'll look at that and how that all comes together. So if you think back to our definitions of life, a cell is alive. Most certainly, every single cell inside of you, well, almost every single cell inside of you is alive. It's breathing. It is. It's exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's breathing. It's taking in energy. It's producing waste. It's doing everything you are doing, but on a microscopic scale. So we've got two different cell types that we look at. Prokaryotic cells, these are your bacteria. Okay. These are very simple cells. We think they were the earliest to evolve. We look at them as having a very simple structure, so nothing complex, no organelles. We'll look at what this means. They have no nucleus. And typically we look at them as being fairly small, or at least smaller than a eukaryotic cell. A eukaryotic cell makes up plants, animals, and fungus. Things you're more familiar with, right? Okay. So they're larger, more complex, evolved later. They have organelles. So this is that internal machinery I was mentioning before, and we'll look at those. They have a nucleus. The nucleus in your cells contains the DNA or your chromosomes. Some of you have heard of that. Some of you may have heard of genes. Not the kind you wear, genes with a G in this case. So more complex, a lot more going on, but that does not mean that they're more important than a prokaryotic cell. When we look at bacteria, they have some of the most important roles on our planet because they actually help to produce all kinds of things that you have to have, and we look at them as being great decomposers. So without them, we'd be surrounded in waste. Gross. So if we look at the difference, this prokaryotic cell at the top, this little tiny guy, versus our eukaryotic cell here. So relative scale, when we look at these guys, many of our bacteria, just so you have some sense, can be on the order of roughly about 10 micrometers. So tiny by comparison. There are certainly some larger ones than that, but when we look by size here, just to give you a sense of what's going on. Not all bacteria are shaped like this. Not all of your cells are round. These are just general representations of what's going on. Here's that nucleus we were talking about and the organelles. And what we'll look at eventually is we've got to think about what these organelles are doing. We've got to think about what this DNA in the nucleus is doing. But we also have to think about something even more important potentially, and it's how do you separate this cell from its outside environment. So we'll spend a lot of time thinking about the membranes that surround cells. Now, in a very basic sense, they're fats. But in a more complex sense, they regulate absolutely everything that moves in and out of this cell. It protects the cell from the external environment. It allows the cell to communicate with other cells. There's a whole lot going on in this plasma membrane. So when we look at things in the environment, I mentioned before to you that biotic refers to the biology or the living components of an environment. So this would be your cells. If you want to think about large organisms, abiotic is everything that is not living. So what would that be? Well, it could be things like temperature, pH, salts. If you're talking about really ecosystem level, we can think about rainfall, right? All of these sorts of things come together. But when we look at most ecosystems, we tend to focus on the biotic parts of it. And we focus on these three things: producers, consumers, and decomposers. So producers are our plants. They're the ones that are going to use sunlight to actually produce food that then the consumers will eat. Consumers eat plants, and they potentially eat other consumers. And then some will argue the most important part of any ecosystem is actually the decomposers. These are going to be your recyclers and your waste management team, basically. So it's going to help break down all the waste in the environment and actually recycle it back into something that is useful for the living components in the environment. So we've got a lot going on. When we talk about energy, we'll look at how energy is coming in the form of sunlight. It's going to get converted into a chemical energy form, and then eventually it'll all get broken down and we'll lose most of our energy to heat. Turns out that organisms are not super efficient at conversion of energy. We lose a lot of energy to heat. For you, that's fine. We have to maintain your warm body temperature. For other organisms, this is more of a risk, and we'll talk about that later on. So we see energy kind of moving through an ecosystem or any system. So energy moves through. But we also have here this cycling of nutrients. So what we'll look at is we actually take nutrients and recycle them through an ecosystem. So we'll look at things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon. All of these things we'll look at as being recycled through the environment. And what that means for you as far as availability of those nutrients, because you have to have them to survive. So we'll look at how you can get them from your environment, and how what you use and produce as waste gets recycled back to the environment.